The next speakers is going to be a duo here. Going to be Angie Harbin and Morgan Henderson. That will speaking on Worth the Fight, Urban Preserve Management. I'll introduce Angie. Angie is the Director of Natural Resources for Rincon Consultants. She works out of their San Diego office and serves as the Director for projects throughout Southern California. Her primary expertise lies with wildlife studies in the Endangered Species Act compliance. She's well versed in preparation and implementation of habitat restoration projects, overseeing teams that do this work in a variety of habitats for the benefit of sensitive species in the region. She is an alumnus of UC Davis, a fellow Aggie up here, which is great. She has a degree in wildlife fish and conservation biology, her master's degree from the graduate group in ecology. Most of her current work is within the coastal sage scrub, grassland, and riparian habitats of San Diego County. Although she spent the last 20 years working in environments as diverse as tropical wetlands of Belize, estuaries of the North Coast, agricultural lands of Central and Imperial Valleys, and deserts of the Southwest. So her boots have been all over the place.
Yep.
And Morgan will also be, you guys are splitting this, right? So Morgan is wildlife biologist with Rincon Consultants with a background in riparian habitats and restoration through invasive removal. She is also with Rincon San Diego office and another Aggie, another UC Davis alumnus. So go Aggies. She's worked in the San Diego County for 5 years along various river systems, including the San Diego River as well as the San Guido River. She has a passion for restoring these areas back to their original habitat, makeup through invasive species identification and mapping, informing restoration plans, both short and long term. Through her work, she has seen firsthand the positive impact invasive removal can have on sensitive species and encourages others to participate in restoring native waterways and wildlife corridors. All right. Thank you. Very thorough. You guys have done a lot of great work. So Worth the Fight, Urban Preserve Management.
All right, we're ready to go here. Well, thank you so much. Good afternoon. Morgan and I are really excited to be here today to talk to you about our project here. We're going to go back down to Southern California, San Diego County. The Crosby. Let's see. Next slide. It's not going. What's the trick here?
Yeah, give it a second. It's been a little slow to advance.
Okay.
I think it will. It usually does. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
It's been a long weekend for everybody.
Uh-huh.
This computer included.
Yes, it's tired. Yeah, that's okay. All right, here we go. Woohoo, thank you. So the Crosby is located inland of the city of Encinitas. And so we're talking north central San Diego County. And you can't tell from this map, but it's a pretty urbanized area. I think Barry set us up really well for this in talking about the urbanization in Southern California and what we're dealing with in terms of management of preserves in Southern California. Rancho Santa Fe is a community that's very exclusive, upscale community. Most of the homes in Rancho Santa Fe are stately mansions, lots of gated communities. So this particular preserve, the Crosby, was created as mitigation for a development project. And that development project happened in the early 2000s. So it was set aside as a preserve in 2006. And as you can see, our preserve here is the red line. So it's focused on the San Diego River corridor. And the main point of the preserve is really to enhance and restore the habitats in the riparian area and the adjacent upland canyons. And we've got a lot of pressures from the external sources going on here with the residential development that was put in as part of the project for which we're mitigating in this preserve. There's a golf course there that has permanent water sources. There are trails that go through the preserve for recreational access. We've got roads, Del Rios Highway. As you go south along the river, it becomes more urbanized. To the north, we end up hitting the city of Escondido. So lots of urbanization, lots of pressures. We're really sandwiched in between all of those. And this isn't a very wide riparian corridor. It's 500 to 700 feet in most places, but what we're trying to illustrate is how valuable these areas are, not just as corridors for wildlife, but as the habitat for wildlife. This is what we have to work with at this point in a lot of our urbanized areas. So We are within the San Diego County Multiple Species Conservation Plan boundaries. So this project had to comply with the Habitat Management Plan guidelines when they put together the plan for the long-term management of the preserve to mitigate for the project. Another thing that I want to point out is that we are about 8 miles upstream from the Pacific Ocean here. And the preserve overall is about 170 acres. So there's numerous stakeholders involved in this preserve. Of course, all the permitting agencies that are interested in what happens with the preserve. This is a long-term preserve. It needs to be here in perpetuity to preserve habitat for native species as part of the conditions of the permit. So the regulatory agencies like Fish and Wildlife Service and California Department of Fish and Wildlife are very interested in what happens here. Other stakeholders involved are local conservation organizations, and they're actually very instrumental in helping to get some of the restoration projects happening on San Diego River, not just upstream, downstream, but also they want to make sure that, you know, there's a continuous enhancement, restoration of habitats and reduction of invasive species so that we're not continually providing source populations. So they are involved in what we do as preserve managers, and we, Rincon, are actually the long-term preserve manager for the project. The easement for the site is held by the county under the MSCP. And the funding in this case actually comes from the Crosby Homeowners Association, sort of an unusual arrangement, but that was what was established in the early 2000s. So the fees that the homeowners pay every month, a little tiny bit of that goes to funding the long-term management. There's some challenges associated with that, but we're not going to get into those details. Happy to discuss later if anybody has questions. So just to go over, the habitat management areas are divided up based on the priorities for those areas. So it looks a little bit weird that we've got a couple of isolated patches, but those areas are actually vernal pool areas for HMA2. HMA7 is the Del Mar Manzanita. So those were particularly sensitive resources that needed to be avoided by the project. And just the nature of the resources, preserving and managing that isolated patch seems to be working. The rest of the areas are primarily focused on riparian southern willow scrub and coastal Dagan coastal sage scrub habitat enhancement. So our overall management plan had to be prepared in accordance with the county guidelines. And our purpose is really to provide the framework for the long-term management of the preserve. So we took over managing this preserve in 2008, and there was a short establishment period for the project proponent. But in this case, they didn't actually do a whole lot of restoration and enhancement. Typically, you have an establishment period where there are pretty high success criteria and standards before you move on to the long-term preserve manager. In this case, there was still quite a bit of work to be done on the site to get it to a state where it's providing high quality habitat for sensitive species of the region. So our objective is to provide that in perpetuity protection and enhancement of the natural areas on the site for MSCP resources, with the primary goal of working with all of those stakeholders and local organizations to maintain that continuous native riparian corridor and the upland canyons. So we have a number of management tasks that we carry out every year on the site, and some of these vary year by year. Our funding is pretty static every year, so we have to prioritize what we're going to do every year. But the management tasks laid out in the plan that we need to make sure we do our best with prioritizing are active habitat restoration, invasive species monitoring and removal, and that's becoming very key and even more crucial. And Morgan's going to talk about that in more detail. Focused biological surveys, and we don't do focus surveys for everything every year. We alternate, but we're really just trying to make sure we're tracking the population trends, particularly of sensitive species. Adaptive management, coming up with solutions as we encounter problems, typical site maintenance, fencing, signage, dealing with trespassing, vandalism, that unfortunately ticked up during COVID. teenagers in the area wanting to go out and find something to do. So we had a lot of trespassing going on. Public outreach, just on that note, we do try to engage the community. We have a community website. We get people out in the field for site walks to see what we're doing so that they understand the importance of the preserve and why we're managing it the way that we are. That also had to take a little bit of a pause during COVID, but hoping to re-engage the community again in person beyond. We also have a lot of social media outreach to try to get word out about what we're doing. And then the annual agency reporting. So I talked a little bit about the habitats on the site. We've got riparian corridors, and I feel like this site is just kind of a Disneyland for Southern California biologists, because you've got all of the sort of inland resources that you could really want to study and look at for sensitive species. We've got vernal pools, we've got coastal sage scrub and maritime chaparral. We've got freshwater marsh, and we've got grassland habitats, both native and non-native. So the habitats that we are managing, those habitats for listed species, and the listed species that we have in the area that we are trying to restore and enhance the habitats for and have been working on for the last 15 years is coastal California gnatcatcher in the Diegan coastal sage scrub. Coastal California gnatcatchers really prefer high quality habitat. They don't typically nest in disturbed habitat. So trying to improve the quality of the coastal sage scrub. The southern riparian scrub habitat, Leafspel's vireo, really needs that willow understory. That's where they nest, and they prefer to have some sort of tree structure above for perching. So a lot of our riparian areas were really chock full of eucalyptus and arundo when we started out this restoration project and took over the preserve management. So we've had some very large scale eucalyptus removal efforts to try to enhance that habitat for Leafspel's vireo. The vernal pools that I mentioned, we've observed San Diego fairy shrimp there in the past, so we're just continuing to maintain those vernal pool areas for the species. And then we have some open areas along the riparian corridor that we're maintaining as freshwater marsh habitat. We've been hoping that we get some pond turtles in there. So far haven't, unfortunately. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit, but just a little bit of a spoiler alert. Morgan's going to talk about the light-footed ridgeways rail, but light-footed ridgeways rails typically occur in our coastal salt marsh habitats, and the Southern California subspecies is the light-footed one. We have a Yuma ridgeways rail that occurs several hundred miles to the east in the Imperial Valley, sort of freshwater wetland habitats. But a little spoiler alert about the ridgeways rail, because it's not something that was ever expected to be on the site. But just this is kind of our current information and stats on the site in terms of all of the different species and illustrating how valuable this site is, even though we are in this urbanized setting. We've got 288 different plant species, 72% of those are native. We've got 123 different wildlife species. 25 of the plant species are rare plants, and 5 of those are federally listed. And we have a really interesting population of Del Mar manzanita. That was one of those isolated sites, and supposedly that was when it was mapped originally, and a lot of the reason it had to be avoided was it was considered the most contiguous stand of Del Mar manzanita that continued to be present in the world. So very important to maintain that population. And then a lot of the rare plants are associated with the vernal pool habitat, the button celery, mason mint. And we have critical habitat for 3 federally listed plant species, either on or directly adjacent to the site. 17 of our wildlife species are sensitive, and then the 4 federally listed ones that I just talked about. So I'm not going to talk about this in detail. You know, this area is designated in the MSCP as a biological linkage area that's crucial to linking wildlife movement throughout the region. So we all know how important that is, but I think another point that we want to make is that it's not just a linkage area, it's also persistent habitat for our region in urbanized settings for listed species and native habitats. And so it is quite important, even though we're surrounded by developed areas. This is just quickly some of the timeline of the habitat restoration activities that we've done at the site. Starting in '09, we did mass eucalyptus removal in the riparian areas, put in plantings of willow, mule fat, sycamore, but we've actually had a lot of natural recruitment once we got the eucalyptus out of there. Continued to do more of that, but doing it in a way where we were girdling to leave some of the snags behind for raptor nesting. Also had acacia removal within the riparian corridor, and then a fair amount of Diegan coastal sage scrub enhancement, weed treatment, and then planting of the native species. Recently, we've been planting some pokey native stuff to try to deter vandalism and trespassing, like California rose and cactus. Just some pictures of August of '08 before we removed the eucalyptus. And then in 2010, after the removal, the riparian corridor starting to come back. And the same thing here. This was the subsequent removal effort on the left, and then afterwards on the right. It's the far corner there. Coastal sage scrub enhancement efforts, very weedy on the left in '08, and then June of 2022, looking like a much healthier community. Just further illustrating the improvements in the quality of the coastal sage scrub habitat on the site with our weed treatment and planting effort. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Morgan, who's going to talk about the management constraints and challenges, as well as the population trends with invasive species and sensitive species. So
I know I'm lucky enough to be actually the one who gets to go out to the site. Angie doesn't make it out there very often, but it is a really gorgeous preserve, and I'm really excited to be sharing it with you guys. So yeah, as Angie kind of touched upon earlier in our presentation, there are quite a few management challenges that we face with this project. We're working with a lot of different entities, and all those different entities have a lot of different opinions about what should be done along the corridor. So we're kind of part of that, trying to manage what our priorities are, along with coordination with all of those other folks who are interested. We don't have a substantial buffer. Like Angie mentioned, the residential area that this was a preserve created for that project. It actually contains a golf course, and in some areas, our native habitat is only separated from this golf course by a chain link fence. So we are right up against, that hardcore urbanization of golf courses, and the management that comes along with residential landscaping, where, you have lots of ornamentals right next to, your native plants that you want to protect from any ornamentals that might want to capitalize on that area as well. And then obviously the upstream, downstream effects of working along a river corridor. We want to make sure that we're in coordination so that we're not, spending time working on an exotic species when our upstream neighbors are working on a completely different exotic species and not coordinating that. And then we also face the challenge that a lot of us have, is that, funding for a project like this is not super prevalent. And the challenge that we face ourselves is that we are a private entity. And so we don't qualify for a lot of the same grants that public lands might be able to apply for, in order to make sure that we're coordinating with all of these entities who might get grant money to work on exotic species that we don't get money to kind of work around. That we have to prioritize our different things with the budget that we're given from our HOA. So we definitely have to manage our different invasive species that are prevalent on the preserve itself. We've got weeds, bullfrogs, and brown-headed cowbirds, which are our main top 3 pests that we're managing right now. As Angie mentioned, we were pretty strong on our weeds right off the bat. We did a lot of eucalyptus removal, palm removal, stinkwort removal, especially in those vernal pool areas, as soon as we took over the project. And we've seen some we've been continuously treating and annually, and we've been seeing some positive trends in terms of weeds, which is exciting. And then with bullfrogs, when we first came onto the project, there had been complaints from residents, especially seeing bullfrogs around their swimming pools and in their gardens and things like that. But luckily we didn't have too much of that actually in the riparian corridor, which was kind of exciting. So all we had to do was really focus on capturing those spawn eggs pretty early on in their breeding season, and haven't had a huge issue with that since 2011, which is exciting. We have heard a couple of complaints from residents recently about some new bullfrogs in the swimming pool areas again. So we're keeping an eye on all of that. And then brown-headed cowbirds is actually our newest challenge. That one, we saw an increase over the last year of 95%. We had originally only seen 1 or 2 here and there along the preserve, but we actually have seen a huge increase in that population. So we're working on prioritizing some trapping and coordination with all of our partners along the stream to make sure that we're really focusing on that population. And now the really exciting part. These are 5 species that are sensitive or threatened on our preserve that actually have seen an expansion in their populations. So our Delmar manzanita, like Angie mentioned, was the largest contiguous population in the world in 1998 when they did the original first survey. We are happy to report that is still the case. And they're thriving, they're doing really well. We're starting to see a couple of eucalyptus saplings pop up, but those are pretty easy to manage as long as they're still saplings. So we're managing that. Ambrosia pumila, we just saw the first sprouts in 2018, and with the help of SDMMP, which is the rare plant monitoring group in San Diego. They've been monitoring them annually, and we're seeing a huge growth in their population. It's funny, this one's actually right up against the golf course. It's in one of those areas that I was talking about earlier that's like separated by a chain link fence. So rare plants right there. We've got Leafspell's vireo. We had always seen a few opportunistic observations of this species during our regular monitoring of the areas over the years. But we finally last year got a permitted biologist out to actually do a series of surveys for LBV. And they recorded 2 confirmed family groups of LBV in one of our HMAs. And then 2 unpaired males that are hanging out in the area consistently. And then 2 other transient LBV who were not necessarily exhibiting any nesting activities. But we're using the corridor to pass through, which is also a huge important thing that our preserve does, is serve as that corridor. And then we've got California gnatcatcher. In 2013, we had a permitted biologist out, and they recorded 2 males in our Diegan sage scrub. And like Angie said, they really require good quality habitat in order to increase their population. And in 2021, we had another permitted biologist survey come out, and they had 3 confirmed pairs of gnatcatcher in our Diegan sage scrubs. That was really exciting. And then the last one is, of course, Angie spoiled it earlier, but we have our Ridgway's rail. The first observations were actually last year during those LBV surveys that we had going, and they confirmed 2 individual birds that were along the river corridor, and they were moving around quite a bit. So they like the area, they like multiple aspects of the area, so we're hoping that they stick around. We're going to continue monitoring for those and hopefully schedule some surveys depending on how much funding we have to move around to do that. So this is just a map of the rare plant surveys that we did back in 2019. The heaviest area that we saw lots of these rare plants is actually in our vernal pool area, which is our HMA2. And it's kind of in the northern part of this, of the preserve. And you can kind of see the cutout down here, but we have some absolutely incredible rare plant species in that habitat, as well as the rest of our preserve. This is from our Lease Bells Vireo surveys that just happened last year. You can see a large collection of the observations were happening in HMA3, which is kind of in that northern portion of the preserve. And then the blue dots that you see on the map that kind of span the entire length of the project are the brown-headed cowbird observations. So we know that from this map that we're going to have to set up traps all along our preserve, but this data is super helpful for planning those. And then also during that survey, they collected information about various other species, including the California gnatcatcher. And the Ridgeways rail. The Ridgeways rail is the light green that you can kind of see. So our conclusions from, managing this preserve for this many years is that it is worth the effort to remove those invasive species, to do plantings, to just keep at it even with low funding, to work with partners to make sure that we're preserving these areas for these species. We've seen them come back, we've seen their populations increase, and we're really excited to see through future surveys how those keep increasing over time. So thank you.